LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole. I can see it in your eyes. You have the look of a man who accepts what he sees because he is expecting to wake up. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you want to know what it is?
Right now, we're inside a computer program.
Is it really so hard to believe? Your appearance now is what we call residual self-image. It is the mental projection of your digital self.
This isn't real.
What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain. What is real? How do you define real? 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 What is real? How do you define?
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Bernardo Kastrup, who joins us to discuss his latest book, Brief Peeks Beyond, Critical Essays on Metaphysics, Neuroscience, Free Will, Skepticism and Culture. A multifaceted exploration and critique of the human condition as it is presently manifested, Brief Peeks Beyond addresses science and philosophy, explores the underlying nature of reality, the state of our society and culture, the influence of the mainstream media, the nature of free will, and a number of other topics. Each of these short, self-contained essays contributes to an emerging picture that challenges present mainstream views and behaviours and offers a sane alternative. The core theme which emerges is a critique of both scientific and philosophical materialism. Together, they offer an exploration of life, the universe and everything which most secular individuals and institutions take for granted. Materialism is seen as the very embodiment of rationalism and reason, the pride of a progressive scientific age, and a vital bulwark against the rising tide of religious fundamentalism. However, taken to extremes, is it possible that materialism, both scientific and philosophical, with its profound influence on how we view ourselves, each other, and the world around us, could be driving humanity to a place every bit as dark as any other brand of fanaticism? Hello and welcome, Bernardo, and thank you so much for joining us again on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Fantastic to be here again, Greg. It was fun last time. I'm looking forward to it.
Excellent. Well, today we're going to be talking about your latest book. It's entitled Brief Peeks Beyond. Subtitle is Critical Essays on Metaphysics, Neuroscience, Free Will, Skepticism and Culture. Before we get into that, just tell listeners a little bit about your background and your work in general.
My educational background is in computer engineering. I have a PhD in computer engineering with specializations in what we call reconfigurable computing or adaptive computing and artificial intelligence, where I did some work a few years ago as well. So that's my educational background. I have a business background as well, which is my daily life, and some philosophy background, which is the work that we would be talking about here today. I've written 5 philosophy books now, mainly on metaphysics, philosophy of mind, ontology, things like that.
Okay, well, last time we spoke, we were discussing your book at the time, which was Why Materialism is Baloney. And with the new book, you still have the materialistic worldview very much in your sights. Perhaps, I think most people will get an idea of what we're talking about when we say materialistic worldview, but perhaps for those who are a bit unsure, you could just briefly say what this outlook is. Also then say how you've moved on from the last book, because you do say that you felt in the past that you'd held back a little bit with some of your ideas and opinions and views because you wanted to, reach a certain audience, and that with this new collection, really it's kind of you want to push the boundaries a bit, and just really, really say what you think. Yeah.
Well, to start from the beginning, the word materialism has 2 associations, and it's important to distinguish between them. You have ethical materialism and you have philosophical materialism. The first one is your general approach to life. You're a materialistic person, like Madonna's material girl. You like objects, you like to accumulate things, and money is important, status is important. That's one thing. The other thing is philosophical materialism, which is this idea that the real world, the real reality, is constituted of matter and energy fundamentally outside consciousness, independent of consciousness, even though the only carrier of reality that you have, the only means you have to know reality is your consciousness. Things that you're not conscious of might as well not exist as far as you're concerned. So materialism is an inference. It says the contents of our awareness originate from a world fundamentally outside consciousness. We don't have direct access to that world, but we can infer its existence, because if your experiences were just a kind of dream, how come we are all sharing the same dream? How come you wake up to where the world has gone, apparently without your conscious participation in the morning, and so on and so forth? So the materialism I'm talking about is a philosophical materialism. It's an ontology, a worldview, a description of the fundamental nature of reality, which I think is wrong. But as it turns out, this philosophical materialism is also conducive to a certain way of living your life, to a certain approach to life. And not only that, to a certain way of conducting scientific research, to a certain way of conducting politics, to a certain way of organizing our production systems according to a certain economic system, so to say. So at the end, these 2 versions of materialism sort of intermingle, but it's important that we differentiate them in order to set the meaning of the word correctly. So what I did in this latest book, well, in the previous book, Why Materialism is Baloney, I focused on explaining why materialism, philosophical materialism, was wrong, and what the alternative could be, an alternative that I claim is more logical, more parsimonious, and more empirically honest, more consistent with the observed facts of existence. So that was the focus of that previous book. In the new one, I summarize the previous book, but then I go further. I take it into the implications of this new, it's a very old philosophy, but the implications of this alternative ontological worldview, this alternative to materialism, which I call, and many others in philosophy call idealism, what it implies as far as our culture, as far as the way science is conducted, especially neuroscience. What does it imply as far as the meaning of the word skepticism, free will, healthcare? So I explore all the implications, and I am quite critical in certain points, especially regarding science and culture. I'm quite critical of the way these things are done today.
Yeah, this materialistic worldview is not everywhere in the world, of course, but it just is, particularly in the West, is presented as ultimately rational. And this goes right back to, in the wake of the Renaissance, but particularly as the scientific revolution got underway in the 19th, 20th century, right all the way through. And it does affect absolutely every aspect of our lives. And perhaps being presented as thoroughly rational, people are not inclined to, superficially at least, see any negatives to that. But actually, as you break down in various chapters of the book, if it affects our worldview, then it affects how we think about ourselves, about each other, and that in turn affects our actions. And actually, you pointed out how the materialistic worldview is very much working in a symbiotic relationship with the modern industrial economy. And this is actually having very negative effects in the world in general. And you can see those manifesting now. But of course, because the materialistic worldview and the economic system are interdependent, there's tremendous pressure to keep that juggernaut sort of rolling.
Yeah. Materialism has co-opted rationalism. It portrays itself as almost synonym with logic and rationality. And it has done that by framing the cultural debate in the form of materialism versus religion, or materialism versus dualism, the idea that there is matter and there is a separate, fundamentally independent spiritual realm. And by doing that, it sort of hijacked the rational high ground, so to say. But that's illegitimate, because it seems to assume that although materialism is indeed rational, it's based on rational inferences, it frames itself as the only rational worldview. And that isn't true. That's something that has emerged over the last 100, 150 years, and it is simply not true. So what I try to do is to emphasize what the alternative is, what the rational, logical, empirically consistent alternative is. But my voice is a small voice. People who are trying to get this message across are in the minority, and we are even put in the same bin as some woo-woo stuff, some wacko things going on in the fringes of the culture. We are often labeled under that category, which is somewhat ridiculous, but that's how these things tend to be portrayed today. And as a result, materialism is rampant as a worldview. And I don't mean this in necessarily a conspiratory way. I mean, most of us, at a deep emotional level, sort of adopt materialist views. When somebody dies, we become very sad. We react emotionally as if that person were gone forever, that consciousness were gone forever. We indulge in consumerism, in the accumulation of material goods as if it were the meaning of life. And according to materialism, it is the meaning of life, the only meaning that can be in life, because if all that endures is matter, consciousness being just a secondary effect of temporary, ephemeral arrangements of matter, then the only meaningful goal you can have in life is to accumulate material goods, to accumulate objects, and to work hard to buy the next car and the next house and more clothes and whatnot. So it percolates into the culture and changes our behavior. And at a higher level, it is highly synergistic with the economic system, because if the only meaning in life is to accumulate material goods, hey, there you go. There you have a demand for an insanely consumeristic economic system that is fundamentally dependent on growth, while the earth as a whole isn't growing. So it's an unsustainable economic system as well, which feeds on this worldview.
Well, I've never heard of anyone who was on their deathbed and said, I'm so glad I accumulated all this stuff. I'm so glad that, I have this status, because what those moments tend to reveal to you, if you have time to contemplate your own death, to actually face it as in, this is going to happen soon, they tend to say things like, I wish I had spent more time with my family and friends. I wish I'd done something else with my life. I'd done what I was meant to do, or done what I really wanted to do. Typically someone will say, I was an industrialist and I really wanted to be an actor, and those sorts of things. Now, I'm generalizing, but I don't tend to hear anecdotes about people, who that's the most important achievement to them. Some people die in as good a place as you can, when you move on, and they're thankful for everything they've had and the people in their lives. It's as painless as as passing on can be. But as I say, it's just, I mean, I think back to ancient cultures burying people with their worldly possessions. But I guess that was informed again by, beliefs that they had. But I'm just very struck by the how often that sort of reflection occurs. And I meet more and more people now. It's interesting what you say about materialism running rampant. I'm starting to see meet more and more people who are looking to change the way they do things, whether it's downsizing or looking for a new career. And I think this touches upon what you get into in the book somewhat, that we're in a period of change now, that however long it takes, 25 years, 50 years, another whole generation, the materialistic worldview is beginning to sort of crack at the seams for the reasons that you mentioned, with natural limits.
Yeah, well, there's so many good points you raise and so many things I would have to say about this. Let me try to cover at least some of them. You mentioned the point about more primitive, well, primitive is the wrong word, pre-literate cultures which buried their people with objects. The interesting thing to notice, though, is that for them, those objects were not outside consciousness. Those objects were not outside their inner lives, outside their subjective perspective of the world. And that's why they were buried together, precisely because they were not materialists. And today we don't do that, because what's the point anyway? When you're dead, your consciousness is over. Only those objects stay. They have nowhere to go. So what's the point of burying them with you? So actually it's the other way around. And when people are about to die and they know that, the defense mechanisms that their intellect, their rationality has built around the core of their being, in order to give some artificial meaning to their lives, those defense mechanisms begin to crack, right? Because the imminence of death, that inescapable prospect, forces you to be honest with yourself and to pay attention to what is happening just below the threshold of your ordinary awareness, just below the threshold of self-reflection, where a lot of truth lies. And then they realize that the only thing that has really been true all along has been their inner lives, their feelings, the love they felt towards their loved ones. That has been the only truth. Everything else was a story induced by the materialistic culture we live in. And I mean materialistic in the philosophical sense, this culture that tells you that reality is outside our inner lives, outside our subjective perspective, our conscious awareness. And they have to acknowledge that. But by then it's kind of late, because by then they are left with very little time and their whole lives is behind them. And it would be nice if we would wake up to the true reality sooner, while we still have time to make our lives count in a more meaningful way. And I think in a sense, for whatever reasons that are very difficult to pin down, the culture is slowly moving in that direction. If I were to risk a guess for why this is happening, I think it has to do with the fact that this system of thought, this materialistic system of thought, it endures until it is pursued to its logical contradiction. In other words, the more you indulge in a materialist worldview, buying objects, working harder, earning more money, being successful in life according to the cultural definition of success, achieving more status, more prestige, and so on, and having a bigger house. As you achieve all this, you are catching the ghosts, and you're realizing that they are just ghosts, that there is nothing there, there is no substance. Once you catch the ghost, only then do you see that it isn't really there and was never there to begin with. That these things ultimately do not deliver any sense of meaning, any sense of true purpose. They don't put your demons to rest, so to say. And we are realizing that precisely because we have been indulging so long in this crazy pursuits. We're realizing their hollowness, and we are beginning to seek for alternatives before it is too late, before we are lying on our deathbeds, and this can only be good.
The materialistic worldview, from a sort of scientific perspective, as it were, rests on what we can measure, and what we can see. And that's why the other aspects of reality in our inner life are kind of sidelined. But it really depends on how you view experience. Materialists, particularly, hardened materialistic scientists and philosophers deny their own inner life, and then sort of will say that subjective experience is somehow not important, or certainly should not be paid attention to in any meaningful way, because if it doesn't show up on the dials and of their gadgets, then it isn't there. But as you point out, that actually turns out to be the most important thing to us. And I think this idea that if you can't quantify something, or you can't make very definite statements about it, about your experience that also apply exactly to someone else's, then, you haven't established a rule or a pattern, so therefore it's irrelevant.
Yeah, I think, look, subjective experience is all there is. When you're looking at a dial on an instrument, what you see is an experience, is the experience of seeing, is a perception. When you're talking to another scientist in a conference and the other scientist is reporting his results to you, which happen to be consistent with yours, you're watching and listening to the other scientist is a subjective experience in your mind. It can't be anything else. If it were, you wouldn't know about it and you wouldn't be talking about it. So ultimately, there is only subjective experience. What materialists would say is that certain subjective experiences are personal. They exist only inside your own head because they're generated by your brain without any modulation by external stimuli. And those you can discard because those are just an epiphenomenon of brain activity and there is no meaning in it. Your love, your fears, your hallucinations, there is no meaning in that anyway. It's just some crazy stuff happening in your head. And the only things that are real are those subjective experiences that happen to be shared, that you can confirm through interaction with others or through multiple measurements in space and time. They are also subjective experiences, but they happen to be shared. And then materialists will say, well, since they are shared, they cannot be creations of my head, so they have to be outside my consciousness. But that assumes that your consciousness is generated in your head, which is precisely the point in contention. So in a sense, it's a circular argument by materialists. If we drop that assumption, that consciousness is generated by the brain, then we are left with the following clear empirical facts. Everything I know about my own body is in my consciousness, otherwise I wouldn't know about it. So probably, on an empirical basis alone, it is my body and my brain that are in my consciousness. It is everything I experience in the world, including shared experiences, that are in my consciousness. And if my consciousness is not in my body, then the fact that bodies are separate across people does not entail that our respective psyches are also separate. And if the psyches are not separate, then the fact that there is such a thing as shared experience isn't a contradiction, isn't a problem at all. It's just a set of subjective facts that arises concurrently in the psyches of multiple people because psyches are fundamentally connected at the bottom, most obfuscated level.
I'm reminded of some of the work that Rupert Sheldrake and others have done, which kind of suggests that consciousness is, like some kind of field, as it were, that we as, individual bags of flesh are within temporarily. And, his work with links between individuals, including, humans and animals and what have you. And there's been lots of other work done in this. And, even just the simple, thinking of someone and then the phone rings and it's them. Or, that his work on dogs who know when their owner's coming home. There's so much stuff that's been piling up for so long. Particularly actually since, the dawn of quantum physics, that suggests there's interconnectedness, but it's been proving elusive, and in subjective terms it feels very, very real. I've experienced all sorts of things like that in my life, including something I love doing, which is staring at people and getting them to turn around. I've tried that so many times, and it very often, more than 50% of the time, it works. People say, "What do you mean works?" Well, I stare at them, they turn round. I can't say anything beyond that. I don't know what the mechanisms are, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, you're alluding to psi, what's called psi phenomena. I think one danger in the culture here is that even psi phenomena, even if they are proven and accepted, you can still interpret them in a materialistic manner. and even Rupert's work can be interpreted like that, which is the danger. I mean, the idea that mind is a kind of field still allows for that field to be generated by the brain and then be projected out of the brain, like an antenna generates an electromagnetic field that is then projected out of the antenna, and therefore you pick it up on a radio or a telephone. So this broadcast of a field that is still generated by the brain, this is still materialism. This still assumes or allows for the interpretation of the matter of the brain existing fundamentally outside consciousness, and then creating consciousness as a kind of field that happens to be broadcast outside the brain and allowing for people to peek into each other's minds, and therefore telepathy and having people turn and look at you when you're looking at them, and so on and so forth. So I see this as a danger. This is a concession. It can be seen as a step forward. I ultimately see this as a step backward because it reinforces a fundamental mistake, I think. This unnecessary inference of a whole world outside conscious awareness. I would say that instead of consciousness being a field that exists in addition to matter, but which really exists out there and is generated by the brain and projected out, I would say that the brain is the image of a process in consciousness. That's what it is. It's not outside consciousness. It's just what a dissociation of consciousness, of a broader mind at large, what a dissociation of that mind at large looks like. People with dissociative identity disorder have multiple so-called alters, which are dissociated psychic complexes, different dissociated personalities. They often don't even know of each other, and they take turns in control of the body, so to say. This is a well-known phenomenon in psychology. It's accepted psychiatry in a sense. So my suggestion is that the only ontological primitive, the only fundamental fact of reality is that there is such a thing as mind. Not a human mind. Mind, consciousness, mind at large. And I use the words mind and consciousness to mean the same thing. And living creatures are dissociated alters of this mind at large, which are dissociated in space, as opposed to dissociation in time, which you see within a person's psyche, in a person with dissociative identity disorder. Space and time are just different ways of describing the same thing, as we know since Einstein. So dissociation in space is what we call biology. It's life. Those are dissociated psychic complexes of mind at large. And because they are dissociated, our self-reflective awareness seems to be restricted, seems to be limited, personal, instead of broad and at the scale of the entire cosmos. It's because of that dissociation, I would say. And psi phenomenon happen when you transcend that dissociation momentarily, temporarily, and you gain access to other parts of mind at large, and you peek into other people's minds, or you transmit a signal, so to say, to use a realist metaphor. But I find it dangerous to see mind as just one more field, like the electromagnetic field. This perpetuates a very dangerous mistake.
Yeah, okay, I realize, I mean, I paused before saying the word field because I was searching for a word, but you're absolutely right. I mean, I'd rather hope that, although many people are still dismissive, even if they've never looked at the evidence, many people, including scientists, are actually dismissive of any psi phenomena. And I'd rather hope that as the research became better grounded, that it would cause people to question a few fundamental assumptions. But you're right, of course. There are a number of research fields, but you know what I mean? Research areas which could lend support to some of the key proposition you're putting forward that can also be then just interpreted from a materialistic point of view, even though that interpretation isn't really grounded in anything. It's just, again, it's a speculation, just saying, oh, well, it's probably this, or it looks like it's this. It's got some similarity to something else that we have established, so therefore we'll put it in that category. You mentioned earlier the so-called hard problem of consciousness, as the science puts it. Identifying that as merely an epiphenomenon of the brain that doesn't explain consciousness in any way whatsoever. And it's a bit like the materialistic tendency to name things is in lieu of actually understanding anything about them. You know, like dark matter, for example.
Yeah.
95 point or whatever it is, I can't quite remember, of the universe is dark matter. So, there we go. I think it's time for lunch.
Yes, we feel cozy and warm when we give a name to something we don't understand, because magically it seems to be explained just by the act of labeling it. that happens a lot. Yeah, you're referring to what philosophers would call strong emergence, which is this idea that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain, that single neurons are not conscious at all. They are just pieces of biological machinery, and their functions are carried out in the dark, not accompanied by awareness, by inner experience of any form. But if you put enough neurons together in a complex enough way, then suddenly the whole thing lights up with conscious awareness. That's the idea of strong emergence, which leverages on the very concept of emergence. Now, the concept of emergence is sound. For instance, the fractal shapes of snowflakes is an emergent property of the way water molecules connect together at low temperatures. So you have a higher level property, namely the fractal shape, which arises from lower level properties, namely the characteristics of water molecules and how they interact in low temperature. The problem is that in every known instance of emergence, we can deduce the high level property from the low level properties. For instance, we can run a simulation in a computer and create a snowflake on the screen based on our understanding of water molecules and temperature interactions and so forth. So we can deduce the high-level properties from the low-level ones. Now, when we say that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain, we are saying that we can deduce the warmth of love, the redness of red, how it feels to be disappointed, how it feels to have a bellyache from the mass, charge, and momentum of subatomic particles making up the brain. Now, we can't make that deduction. So to say that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain is merely the labeling of an unknown. It explains exactly nothing. It just gives it a name. And the alternative to this, which worryingly seems to be the trend now, is to say, oh, you know what? Every subatomic particle has a tiny little bit of consciousness. Consciousness is just a property of all matter, like charge, mass, momentum, and so forth. So in addition to those other properties that are already acknowledged, there is also a bit of consciousness. There's the bit of spin, the bit of mass, or several bits of mass, whatever, and there is consciousness as a fundamental property. So there is something it is like to be my book. There is something it is like to be a rock. There is something it is like to be a neuron, but it's just nothing comparable to what it is like to be a human being. But when you put those little neurons, conscious little neurons together, somehow these bits of consciousness add up and complexify and create your inner life. This is called panpsychism, and it's trending now. But you see, it again perpetuates the mistake. It basically says that consciousness is a property of matter. You're still linking everything to matter, even though everything you have always known about matter is a phenomenon in your consciousness. Consciousness is the only carrier of reality we or anyone can ever know, because knowledge is a conscious phenomenon. So what we are doing is we are inferring matter outside consciousness, which can never be completely proven empirically. It's just an inference. And then we are projecting that thing that defines who we are, awareness, consciousness. We are projecting that onto an inference of consciousness. And we are trying to explain consciousness by projecting it onto an inference of consciousness. I mean, this is ridiculous. We are chasing our own tails at light speed. This is contrived. Stop it all. That's what I say. Stop it all. Stick to what you really know. You know your consciousness. You know you're conscious. Therefore, the simplest, most parsimonious alternative to explain reality, if you can explain it all, which is what my work tries to do, is to say all reality are excitations of consciousness. Matter is a particular type of excitation of consciousness, one that is shared, collective across dissociated alters of mind at large, in other words, across people, and one that has a certain persistence, a certain continuity. But it is an excitation of consciousness, just like the feeling of love is an excitation of consciousness. Both are processes unfolding in your subjective inner life, or in subjectivity. That's the alternative that I think makes sense. Panpsychism is an attempt to make nature conform to theory by assuming that rocks are conscious in the complete absence of any evidence that rocks are conscious. It's an attempt to make nature conform to theory as opposed to theory conform to nature. And strong emergence is just labeling an unknown or an appeal to magic. In both cases, nothing is explained.
I've often pondered materialistic scientists and philosophers sort of dismissing consciousness as, to me, I thought it would be the most fundamentally interesting and important avenue to pursue. But I guess for people who have considered this, even, however briefly, and then just kind of walked away, to admit the depth of what is unexplained and what we don't know, and how much, when we start to take on some of your perspectives, how much it tips up the apple cart of materialism. I guess that's too painful for some people, even if in their, darkest private moments, they might say to themselves, yeah, we know almost nothing about what's going on, but I'm just going to focus on my narrow little area of what, what's established, and we'll just leave this consciousness thing, because, we're never going to get anywhere with it.
Yeah, I think, if you look at the historical nexus when materialism really took hold, it was at the end of the 19th century during the scientific revolution. And at first it was a reaction to superstition, but it fit very well with the ethos of the time. It was a time when the West was conquering the world and setting up colonies everywhere. And it was a time when this idea that tough guys and girls face bleak facts was very strong, and it legitimized the colonialist world-conquering approach of Western societies back then. And materialism has come to be seen now, I think, by most people who consider themselves learned, as the reality that tough people acknowledge to be true, because it's the only rational approach. Know what I mean? So there is this synergy between the rationality aspect of it on the one hand, and this image that it seems to project, like, I'm a tough guy, I'm a realistic guy, I face facts in the face, so to say. And it's very difficult to let go of that, because you become invested in it, you invest your identity, you validate yourself as a person by making that investment in that worldview. It validates you as a brave, tough person who faces the facts. And to let go of it is very difficult, especially when this notion that all reality is in consciousness has come to be associated with New Age woo, which is unfortunate. It's a notion that has existed for thousands of years, since the Vedas, the Upanishads in India. We have known this forever. We have just forgotten it in the past couple of 100 years. But we are left with this emotional investment we have in the current reigning worldview, and it may be painful for some to let go of it.
Yes, the danger of identifying with your beliefs and your kind of worldview, personally identifying with that. Some people kind of hold, well, that's who I am, but what happens then when new information comes along? And, then your identity is under threat, and some people would rather hold on to something. Not talking about when they're still convinced of it, but when they're faced with new information, they'd rather say, no, I am this person who identifies with this. A bit like, people who are religious, perhaps, who have a challenge to that. Many of them won't walk away from it or reconsider it because they've come to identify with it. I am, Joe Bloggs, and I am a Catholic, or whatever it happens to be. And we all identify to some extent with beliefs, but I think that's it's not weak-minded, in my opinion, to be able to admit you're wrong, or to change, perhaps do 180-degree turn, if some new information comes your way, you say, do you know what? I should, if I'm honest with myself, I should go with this.
Absolutely. At the same time, I agree with you. It's not a sign of weakness at all. It's a sign of strength to do this. It's precisely the opposite. Yet it's also a very natural psychological dynamics, because since adolescence, we identify ourselves, we give ourselves identity by contrast with others. You tell yourself what you are by telling yourself what you are not, what other people are and you are not. So Richard Dawkins, let's name names here. Richard Dawkins, and I cannot know that, but I speculate in my mind that he reinforces his self-image of somebody who is logical and rational and reasonable. He even started a foundation for reason, so he co-opts this idea of reason. He maintains that self-image by differentiating himself from others who are unreasonable, who are stupid, who do not understand what materialism entails. And then you have somebody like Deepak Chopra, who has been saying forever that all reality unfolds in what he calls cosmic consciousness, which, by the way, is a term even he didn't invent. It comes from a mainstream psychiatrist at the turn of the 20th century, Dr. Maurice Buck, who wrote a book called Cosmic Consciousness with case studies of this. Imagine Richard Dawkins saying, well, Deepak Chopra was right. After all reality unfolds in consciousness, and we might as well call it cosmic consciousness because it's not your personal psyche. Your personal psyche is just a dissociated complex of cosmic consciousness. And he would never make that admission. That would amount to destroying his self-image and ceasing to exist as Richard Dawkins. It's not going to happen. And it's very understandable and even natural from a psychological point of view.
Oh, and I get, to some extent, people like Dawkins and others when they, and it's not limited to materialists, by the way, here, but when they look at some of the murder and mayhem being carried out in the world in the name of religions, whether those people carrying out said acts are actually believers or not, it's being done in that name, and that's part of what fuels, the drive towards materialism, because as you say, it's rational, it involves what can be measured, and it involves things like commerce and, having a regular sort of life and a car and a dishwasher and all the rest of it. It doesn't involve irrational beliefs, spiritual woo-woo nonsense, and it most definitely does not involve crazed unleashing of violence in the name of some non-existent deity.
But that's the thing, you see, that's their cultural victory. That's how they perpetuate materialism. To combat fundamentalism, we do not need to tell another lie. To combat one lie, the lie of fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism in this case, fundamentalism is always bad, but we are talking about religious fundamentalism, so let's stick to it. To combat this lie, we do not need to tell another lie, the lie of materialism. And their cultural success has been to frame the debate precisely in these terms. It's either materialism or it is religious fundamentalism. Hey, wait a moment. There's a much larger world out there. This division, this polarization is completely fallacious. There are many more alternatives, many more ways of looking upon the facts. We do not need one lie to combat the damage of another lie.
And also a follow-on point to that is that, as we mentioned earlier, materialistic fundamentalism is taking us to a very dark place even as we speak. It has been over the course of the 20th century, particularly the second half. So to claim that, only religious fundamentalism is dangerous to our well-being is, as you say, fundamentalism is just bad, and we can see the evidence for it at both ends of the spectrum all around us now.
Absolutely. I mean, just look at the neo-atheist movement, which is actually the anti-religion movement more than the neo-atheist movement. Just look at them and you will see examples of extreme materialistic fundamentalism, an extreme readiness to ignore evidence that is contrary to your views, to reinterpret evidence that is contrary to your views, to freely speculate, postulate, and infer in the absence of any evidence, so long as the conclusion favors your view, and then to go ahead and then to turn around and then criticize other people who are doing the exact same thing, freely speculating, inferring, and postulating in the absence of evidence, but just that their conclusions happen to disagree with yours. So that's definitely fundamentalism, and it's all over the place. It's rampant.
Thinking about Dawkins and some other people who've essentially inferred that consciousness is kind of imaginary, you only think that you're conscious. I mean, that's a thought stopper right there, because it's just, go no further down this avenue of exploration. Why, I can't understand, other than that need to sort of dismiss the whole issue and just brush it under the carpet, why you would deny your own subjective experience. And then these people write books, essentially, to tell us that we're not conscious. And it's like, well, what's writing the book? Who are you writing the book for?
That's...
Why are you telling us that we're not conscious? What's the point? Just don't write books. Just go and sit in a corner and drool.
Well, there is more going on to this here. I think, it's a good point to discuss. I mean, people like Michael Graziano and Daniel Dennett and Patricia Churchland. There's also a British psychologist, I forgot his name for a moment, but anyway, they are called eliminative materialists. So these are materialists who say consciousness is an illusion, it doesn't really exist. And Richard Dawkins sort of endorses that view. At least in one of his tweets, he seems to endorse that view. You see, you might say this is completely absurd, because if it's an illusion, where is that illusion? The illusion itself is in consciousness, right? I mean, whatever consciousness is, it is the carrier of reality we know. It's the primary datum of existence. To call it an illusion has no meaning whatsoever, because it's the primary datum of existence. It's the ground of all theorizing, of all speculating. All theorizing and speculating unfold in consciousness. What's the meaning of theorizing that consciousness is not there? It has no meaning whatsoever. And then you would ask, why did he do this? Well, they do this because of the hard problem of consciousness, because materialism is completely incapable of explaining consciousness as a product of matter, even in principle. They can't do that even in principle. They can't even postulate a coherent speculation for how it happens, let alone a final and detailed one. And it will never happen, because it is consciousness that is speculating about its own origins through its own postulates and abstractions and chasing its own tail. So for you to say that materialistic neuroscience is making progress towards explaining consciousness, the only option you have left then is to say that consciousness itself doesn't exist. Because if you don't do that, you become incapable of showing any progress. How do you get your grants? How do you go to the news and give interviews? How do you get your status? How do you progress your career? You're completely stuck. So the only way around this is to say consciousness doesn't exist, which then puts them in a very strange situation, because what they're actually saying, if you read Dennett carefully, what he's actually saying is that the contents of consciousness do not always correspond to this inferred material world I believe to exist outside consciousness. In other words, certain things you think you see don't match with other people report. Certain things you think you hear are actually hallucinated, or you mistake what you hear, you mistake what you see. Other people tell you you were wrong, that the bird you saw flying in the sky was not really there at all. In other words, illusions, tricks, magician tricks, things straight out of that National Geographic program, brain games, cognitive illusions. And they say, if we can show that everything, all contents of consciousness are a cognitive illusion, then consciousness itself is an illusion. Now, this last step is completely fallacious. It's absurd. It's like saying the earth being flat is an illusion. Therefore, the earth doesn't exist. But what? The earth isn't an illusion. It was an attribute of the earth that I made, flatness, that was an illusion. The earth itself wasn't. And to say that consciousness is an illusion because the contents of consciousness don't seem to be always shared with other people amounts to proclaiming that because the flatness of the earth is an illusion, the earth itself is an illusion, and proclaiming that while standing firmly on the earth. Where are you standing when you say that consciousness is an illusion?
You mentioned variations in experience there, and that suddenly for some reason reminded me of consensus reality. Particularly, I was reading an article recently about UFOs, or perhaps we should be more specific, and sort of what appear to be alien spacecraft of some kind, and how when more than one person sees this thing, then it becomes real. And if only one person sees it, I mean, is it real? But what I find all those sorts of differing perceptions amongst people who've supposedly had the same experience really, really fascinating and almost exhilarating in some ways. You know, even people will have completely different experiences of the same mundane thing. Like, oh yeah, we went to we met up at the bar last night and then we went to see a movie. And, Bob was wearing his new brown leather jacket and he said, he wasn't wearing it. No, he wasn't. It was great. You know what I mean? The sort of, now that's of course our memories, as such as they are imperfect. But what would cause, I suspect, some fundamentalist materialists absolute panic, which would be any sort of melting or blurring at the edges of our reality. I find it incredibly exciting. I love anomalies that make me stop and just go, what the hell is going on? What just happened? You know?
Yeah, that's your personality type, and happens to be largely my personality type as well. I enjoy the mystery. I enjoy the unexplained, but a lot of people are very fearful of it, and they will run away from it as fast as they can, and they will stick to some kind of tentative explanation of reality that puts everything on firm ground.
Another thing that you make, a good point that you make, is that in its own terms, if you actually read a lot of the conventional materialistic explanations for reality, it's actually really quite metaphysical, in the sense that, you know, how much of it is theoretical, you know, doesn't necessarily all tie together. This is a part of this is what we said earlier, you know, about sort of naming things, and therefore that's them somehow explained. So, and in some interpretations, you could say that materialism is just as metaphysical as anything else.
Oh, it's more metaphysical than anything else. If you ask me, it's more metaphysical than any spiritual ontology, and I'll explain why. What do we tend to associate with the word metaphysics? We tend to think of something metaphysical as something that is beyond or behind the concreteness of reality, the things that you can feel, touch, and that are available to your senses. Whatever is beyond that or inaccessible to this experience of concreteness is metaphysical, right? That's how we usually interpret the word. Now, there's nothing more metaphysical than materialism by definition, because materialism will say, when you hold a rock in your hands and you feel its solidity, its concreteness, or if somebody throws a rock in your head and you feel, its inertia, its momentum, its solidity, or if your truck runs you over and then the solidity of the truck is inescapable to you. All of this, according to materialism, is a reproduction of reality generated inside your skull. Reality itself does not have the felt concreteness that you feel when you hold a rock. Reality itself has no color, has no solidity, has no flavors, has no smells. Nothing. It has none of the qualities of experience. And what are concreteness, solidity, and continuity but qualities of experience? Materialism will say that the real reality outside of your head is a purely abstract field of possibilities, a field of particles and energy, and energy fields that have none of the qualities of experience. The closest you can get to describing it accurately is through mathematical equations. Actually, this famous mainstream science, forgot his name, he wrote a book recently in which he basically was willing to bite the bullet and say atoms are just ontological baggage. They are not really out there. Reality is purely mathematical. It's just a set of mathematical equations. What is more metaphysical than this when you say that the real reality outside your skull has none of the qualities of experience? It's just mathematical fields dancing around. Materialism is extremely metaphysical, more so than any other ontology.
Yeah, what is that anyway, mathematical? I mean, that's completely abstract. I mean, what does that mean? I mean, are these sort of little equations made out of like spaghetti or something kind of? Because I'm drawn to think about the spaghetti monster, I suppose. But what is it then? How can there be maths and only maths? It's absurd.
Yeah, it's pure abstraction. But you see, if you who was it? Was it Blake who said that? No, it was not Blake. I forgot who said that a full who consistently pursues his foolishness ends up being wise. Who said that? My memory is failing me now on this Friday morning. But anyway, if you pursue materialism to its ultimate implications, you come full circle. Because what is a purely mathematical world? It's a world of pure abstraction. And where does abstraction exist? In mind, in consciousness. A purely abstract world is a world of pure consciousness. And it's amazing how it comes full circle. But of course, they will resist this very last step that closes the circle.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Be sure to tune in next week for part 2. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programs offering alternative views on a wide range of topics including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. You can also browse and buy a range of publications from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Based on current audience numbers, if everyone who tuned in donated just 5 pence per show, that's about 8 cents US, this could become a full-time, fully funded operation, offering more and more often. During October 2014, over 50,000 of you streamed or downloaded at least one show. Total donations were £7 UK, which currently converts to about $11 US. Whether you listen, donate, or do both, I greatly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to LegalizeFreedom.com.